Good morning. Today is Friday, April 23rd. We are on part 24 of the miracles of Jesus Christ. We are still on the Mount of Olives. There's a lot to think about here. The place is incredibly solemn to us. Now, there is an opportunity for any of us that want to ride a camel. They have the camels there. They deck them out. They really do look really neat. But no one in our group chose to take that opportunity. I think because while it's a cute little diversion, it actually seems a little silly to us. See, we're standing on a mountain where Jesus once stood with earthly feet. And at some point, he will stand here in his glorified body. It's such a solemn place that riding camel just kind of seems like a flippant thing to do. This is where Jesus told the disciples in Matthew 24 and 25 some amazing prophecy. It also speaks to the miracle of this, that Christ, while on this earthly condition, was still fully God, for he knew prophetic word that was coming. Bible scholars call this the Olivet Discourse, and I'm going to start reading from Matthew chapter 24. Just one verse today. Verse 1. Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said, "Do you not see all these things? Most surely I say to you, not one stone will be left here upon another that shall not be tossed around." Now, to understand what has just happened prior to this beginning of Jesus' discourse, Jesus was in the temple. The leaders were getting at him, and he left them with some harsh words in his righteous anger. He had just finished telling all the people in the synagogue that the leaders of the church were hypocrites. They tell the people what they have to do to enter eternity in heaven, but they themselves do not do what they preach. He also said the leaders make the people's burdens twice as hard to bear. Jesus said that the leaders do everything to be seen and admired. They make their religious robes beautiful and ostentatious so that others know their status as soon as they see them. And it's all for the love of honor and glory. In fact, Jesus went on to say that they will seek the best seat at a banquet. They love to be called rabbi by others. And then Jesus tells the common people there, those that exalt themselves by God will be humbled, but those who humble themselves by God will be exalted. Jesus went on with what are called the 7 woes. He said, "Woe to you, hypocrites and Pharisees," and he nailed them. Someday this will be a wonderful Bible study, and maybe we will get to that if the Lord tarries. But just today, let me say that Jesus rightfully gave it to the leaders of the law. He nailed the Pharisees. He nailed the temple leaders. His words had the double-edged sword of the word of the Lord. He hit the hypocritical leaders of that day with the truth. He said to them at one point, "You strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel." In other words, you pick at the tiniest little thing for the common people. You make it incredibly harsh. You call it sin. You give them burdens they don't need, but then you swallow sin like it's the size of a camel, which I find interesting since we're standing on the Mount of Olives, where they're standing right there with camels, hoping one of us goes on a ride. The visual for us that day was in our faces. He called the religious leaders snakes. He said they were a nest of vipers. Years and years ago, when the Big Dutchman and I bought our first home, we bought a home in a place called Musellum Springs. It's a lovely area. It's still very underdeveloped even today, and it's very wooded. And when we started cleaning out a large garage that was on the property, my husband found a nest of copperheads. And he came right out and hollered at me, "Don't go in there." He had to get in there and kill those copperheads. He said there was a lot of them. And my husband's a little bit like Indiana Jones. "I hate snakes." This Big Dutchman, he's over 6'2", but the one thing he has a real issue with is snakes. And he had to get rid of this nest of vipers. And that is the visual I have when Jesus is calling these religious leaders vipers. He said that the Lord would send prophets after Jesus was gone, and that these vipers, these Pharisees, these Sadducees, these leaders of the church, would kill, they would crucify, they would flog, they would shed the blood of the prophets and teachers that the Lord would send in his absence. Because of that, Jesus ended that day with these words to the Pharisees. He said, "And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly, I tell you, all this will come on this generation." And all this was the destruction that was going to come to Jerusalem. This is where Jesus' mind and heart were, because he was standing on the Mount of Olives just after he delivered these woes to the religious hypocrites. Let's read Matthew chapter 42, that verse one more time to set up Jesus' prophecy. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone will be left here upon another that shall not be tossed around." So, the temple was finally finished a few years after Jesus' death, and it was huge, the original temple, and it was gorgeous. The Jewish historian Josephus said that the temple was covered with gold plates, and when the sun shone on them, it was blinding to look at. There were blocks of marble of such pure white that from a distance, strangers who did not know the outlook of Israel thought it was snow on the temple. It took about 80 years to finish. 7 short years after it was completely finished, it was then completely destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. And I just talked about this the other day. I said 1 million people were killed during the destruction of Jerusalem. It is said that at the fall of Jerusalem, the last surviving Jews of the city fled to the temple because it was the strongest and most secure building in the city. Remember, it was covered in marble and gold plates. The Roman soldiers surrounded it. History has written that one drunken soldier started a fire that soon engulfed the entire building. The ornate gold detail that I just talked about melted down from the intense heat in the cracks between the stone walls of the temple. Now, when everything cooled down, the Romans wanted that gold, and in order to retrieve it, they tossed every single stone that was still standing apart from each other. What did Jesus tell the disciples all those years before? He said, "Most assuredly, I tell you, every stone here will be tossed about." The destruction of the temple was so complete that today they have difficulty exactly knowing where the foundation of the temple was. This is the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy, again, when he said not one stone would be left upon another, they would be tossed around. Now, yesterday when we spoke, I said as we stood on the Mount of Olives, we had the same view Christ had. We could see the whole city of Jerusalem. When Jesus stood there that day after giving this prophecy, what we call the Olivet Discourse, to the disciples, he looked over that whole city. He knew what was going to happen. And when Christ left the synagogue just a short time before he had this discourse with his disciples, he knew he was never going back to the synagogue again. That was the last time he would speak to the religious leaders in any capacity of trying to express the word of the Lord to them, the closed-minded men that they were. Jesus knew he was at the end of his earthly time. He was in great agony, not because of what he was going to have to endure, although we know he agonized over that later in the garden. Here's the Mount of Olives. There's this cobbled path I'm going to talk about tomorrow, and at the bottom is the garden. So Jesus had this amazing view of the city, the garden, and he knew that in a short time after his death, Jerusalem would be completely destroyed and 1 million people would be murdered. And that, at the end of that chapter of Matthew 24, he says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem," he cries these words, "you who kill the prophets and stone those who are sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together, even as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" In a couple of days, we're going to talk about the Wailing Wall. This whole Mount of Olives, this whole discourse, this whole next series of tours is intricately woven together, just like the cloak Christ wore, which was eventually bet over by the soldiers as he hung on the cross. You can't have one part without the other. As we stood at a spot on the Mount of Olives, my pastor Mark encouraged us all to do as Jesus had done and pray for the peace of Israel, and as we stood there to pray for those we love and the lost world. And I had written all my prayer requests down on a piece of paper. He gave us a heads up, and all of us did this. And while we stood looking at this city that has so much historical significance on the entire world, I held that paper in my heart, and I prayed for each name on it. And it was truly a moment to treasure. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine on you and give you his precious shalom. I'll see you tomorrow, God willing.